Good afternoon in Europe and Germany for those perhaps joining soon or later when the talk or when the book reading starts. We always start with a still time, calm time, some sitting in silence of a book study or book reading project. What is Zen, plain talk for a beginner's mind, written or edited by Norman Fischer and Susan Moon. And today the second half of the chapter teachings. No, is it teachings or is it teachers? Just a moment. I mix it up. Teachers. The second half of the chapter teachers is to be read today. Contrary to what I had announced in our last little video, I was looking forward to the next one, stages of practice, but it doesn't really matter because I always appreciated the chapter I was on. I appreciate that the most. So I hope this comes across to you. Let us start now with sitting. I'm a bit late. I apologize for it. Let us sit 10 minutes, and then I might join the everyday Zen sit in the afternoon at 4:30 in Germany. In the US, if you want to join, you can also do, because it is open for everybody. It is starting in the morning at 7. For those who join now, we are sitting a little less than 10 minutes from now, and you will then hear the second part of the chapter, Teachers, from the book What is Zen by Norman Fischer and Susan Moon. Again, welcome to this project. Second part of the chapter Teachers of the book What is Zen? Plain Talk for a Beginner's Mind. I will jump in, and again my apologies for abbreviating the sitting period because I'm a bit late today. Susan Moon is asking, among all kinds of Buddhist teachers, Zen teachers seem to have a particularly bad record on the realm of sexual misconduct. What do you think of this? Wow, what a bold question. I'm not sure male Zen teachers, in brackets, sexual offenders are almost always male in our sexist and sexualized world, are any worse than other male Buddhist teachers in this regard, or worse than rabbis, ministers, or Catholic priests. Unfortunately, sexual misconduct by men in religious or other positions of authority is all too common in all walks of life, though you don't often hear about it. But possibly you are right. In any case, a number of prominent Zen teachers have definitely been involved in sexual scandals. Why? The basic reason is clear. People, especially men, have sexual desires that sometimes run away with them. Zen teachers are supposed to be able to deal with their desires without causing harm, but sometimes they aren't able to. Zen is relatively new and interesting in our culture, so Zen teachers may appear more attractive or exotic than other religious figures, and when Zen teachers are involved in scandals, it may make more interesting news. So perhaps Zen scandals get more press, which makes them seem relatively more numerous. But there may be something, as your question implies, that makes Zen more likely to have these problems. First, Zen practice fosters a teacher-student relationship of a particular nature. As we've been discussing in Zen, that relationship is intimate, in brackets, this is the word often used, yet Zen teachers are not gurus. That is to say, Zen teachers, while often highly respected and even revered, are not considered different from or above ordinary people. So if you get very close to your Zen teacher, it might be quite easy for that closeness to slide over into romantic attachment. Our culture is so sexualized and at the same time also repressed that it might be quite common for people to experience the close relationship with teacher as sexual longing. We simply don't have models for a warm spiritual relationship between two individuals, especially when one of them, the teacher, seems to possess powerful spiritual virtue that the other aspires to. So we confuse spiritual feelings with sexual ones. This probably happens a lot and may not be a problem, providing the teacher doesn't get confused. But sometimes the teacher does get confused, mistaking the relationship in exactly the way the student does. Some of the Zen sex scandals I'm aware of were less about evil Zen masters preying on their students than they were about smitten male Zen teachers falling foolishly and tragically in love with their female students. In other cases, it's less a matter of tragic love than the ordinary wandering eye male Zen teachers who have felt themselves falsely, foolishly entitled to the odd affair, given their as they and their students may have felt, exalted spiritual state and all their hard work on behalf of their communities. In brackets, the same dynamic appears in almost all areas of social and institutional life in which powerful men assume larger-than-life leadership roles. Sometimes it is still more complicated. The unfortunate truth is that being a spiritual leader can take a toll on your life. You can get in over your head and not realize that this has happened. Without your knowing it, your intense life can become a burden. Yet your faith and conviction have you trapped in it. And there's nothing like having an illicit affair to blow your life apart. One way to get out of a difficult situation, though not a very good way. And yes, there have been out-and-out Zen sexual predators who have seen fit to use their privileged roles as platforms for the seduction of vulnerable female students. There have been some sad and terrible cases, although even here, the deeper you investigate, the murkier these situations become. I have found that very few human predicaments can be truly reduced to good versus evil, angels versus devils. Everyone, it turns out, is human, with human wounds and human needs. Despite the fact that people need to be held accountable and stopped when they are doing destructive things, it usually turns out that everyone is a victim and everyone bears some responsibility. In several of the more public Zen sexual scandals, it was the collusion of the community, which in some cases was aware, through rumor and sometimes even reliable reporting, of the offense, but did nothing about it, that was almost as disturbing as the original events. Most Zen communities have learned from this history, so well documented by now, and have explicit ethical policies and empowered boards of directors, making this sort of thing far less likely. How is the relationship between a Zen teacher and student different from the relationship between, say, a piano teacher and his or her student? Maybe not so different. In both cases, there is lots of dedicated practice and repetition at the heart of the relationship. So it's not just a personal relationship. There's a practice, a tradition both parties are devoted to. Possibly in the case of the piano, and certainly in the case of Zen, there is the feeling that the practice is about more than a skill to be learned, that it affects and transforms your whole life. In fact, the more I think about it, the less difference I can see between a Zen teacher and any other apprenticeship or mentoring relationship. Every such relationship, at least potentially, brings up the whole of your life through the practice you are learning. Susan. People sometimes speak of Zen practice as training. Is the Zen teacher basically a trainer, like an athletic coach? Like an athletic coach? Norman answers. These various models of teachers and teaching that you are bringing up illustrate various aspects of this great project of transforming one another through sharing a passion for a practice. In this present case, a sport. Yes, a Zen teacher is a piano teacher, a football coach, a therapist, a father, a mother, a brother, a sister, a friend, and whatever else we can think of. But also not. A Zen teacher is just a Zen teacher. A lot of people use the idea of training to describe what we do in Zen. but I have never liked this word because it focuses too much on skill. In sports, you play with more or less skill and you win or lose the game. In our Zoto-Zen tradition, as interpreted by Suzuki Roshi, we practice continuously and endlessly. We're not trying to get better at the practice or to attain increasingly powerful states or reputation. For Suzuki Roshi, beginner's mind was an ideal to keep on going with a lively and sincere spirit, as if constantly beginning again. I can't seem to get past that conception of our practice. So I don't think of myself as being a coach or a teacher, and I don't think of what we are doing as training. I think of it as practice, a word I'm sure I've used hundreds of times in this book. I don't mean practice in the sense of something we are doing in preparation for a performance, but rather than practice in the sense of practicing medicine, practicing law, practicing an art. It is something we are devoted to, something we respect, study, contemplate, and apply in a practical way every day in our lives, hoping to become more and more established in it, but understanding that we will never come to the end of it. But I know many Zen teachers who think of themselves as more or less coaches, and of the practice they do as training. I admire this attitude, and it is the best way for many students. But I find it impossible to think like that. Norman, excuse me please, Sue. To what extent should the student submit to the authority of the teacher? Norman. I already wrote about this earlier when I talked about following your teacher's way and giving her or him the benefit of the doubt, since the whole point of studying Zen is to go beyond your own view and sense of life. So yes, there is a sense in which to study Zen is to submit to the authority of the teacher. If you don't see the teacher as a worthy representative of the Zen tradition that you respect and want to study and practice, what would be the point of having that person as your teacher? I also said that at some point in your practice life, the sense of listening to the teacher without questioning much will and should change. At some point, you will have become immersed enough in the teaching and practice and close enough in your relationship to your teacher that you will have your own views and opinions. A Zen teacher has to be wide enough and flexible enough to be capable of growing and changing in his or her relationships with students. In our tradition, there are explicit teachings about the teacher becoming the student and the student becoming the teacher, with the feeling that this is an essential part of the relationship. But I hear something more profound in your question too. Submitting to the authority of is a phrase that raises hackles and inspires a certain amount of fear. What if the teacher asks me to do something that offends me or is too difficult for me? What if the teacher challenges my most deeply held assumptions and values? Must I submit? Is Zen practice with a teacher like being pushed into a dare, being forced to the edge of the abyss of what I fear most, or being asked to give up what I least want to relinquish? Getting back to the sexual scandal question we were talking about a moment ago, I wonder whether sometimes it wasn't like that. An intimidating male teacher proposing that if the female student were really devoted, really serious, she should be willing to have sex with him, overcoming her small-minded attachment to morality and perhaps her marriage. I think This is a challenging question and one not so easily dismissed. Yes, we can easily dismiss the example I just gave. A teacher shouldn't and can't compel a student to break a precept or commit a crime. And in my opinion, any Zen teacher who is pressing a student to do this or that inappropriately or outrageously scary thing for her and his own good to stretch the student is being abusive. And yet we do have to go into those walled-off scary areas of our heart. We do have to make peace with and go beyond what we most fear, including and especially our fear of death. Seeing the emptiness of all phenomena, which means fully entering without fear this unrepeatable and evanescent dreamlike moment of our lives, does involve our letting go of everything. As long as we determine that in our study of Zen we will permit this but not that, go this far but no further, we will remain imprisoned in ourselves. So in the end, yes, we will have to surrender everything to our teacher, to the teacher within, or to the ultimate truth the teacher represents. We will have to let go of everything, renounce everything. That is, let go of and renounce everything we think we have and believe, but never have had and never really believed, because there was never any real basis for that belief. But this doesn't mean submitting to another human being's wishes for us, or another human being's point of view. Suzuki Roshi once said, "When you become you, Zen becomes Zen." A good solid Zen teacher knows that your practice is not fulfilled by your conforming to her ideas about Zen. She knows that real life involves letting go, that this is a difficult and yet a lovely prospect, and is willing to walk side by side with you as you go forth as far as you possibly can toward liberation from yourself in this lifetime. I want to push you on this. I'm not quite satisfied, says Susan Moon. Let's say it's okay for the student to get up extra early to make the teacher tea. That's a tradition. Okay. Should the student also iron the teacher's robes? What about handkerchiefs? How does the student know whether what's being asked is appropriate? How does the student know the teacher is what you call a good, solid Zen teacher? Norman. It would be hard, I suppose, to compose a list of things it is okay to do for your teacher and things not okay. In any case, the list would always be contextual. For instance, in the context of monastic life and even a sesshin, we might do things to take care of our teacher that we wouldn't do in more everyday situations. Like your example of making tea before zazen. When I was the abbot of the Zen Center, assistants used to do that for me. But now, in everyday Zen, no one comes to my house to make me morning tea. I confess that I have some prejudice about this point. I don't like people making a fuss over me. When I go to Zen places that have a tradition of making what I would consider too big a fuss over their teachers, and the students there start to make a fuss over me, I usually ask them to please not do it. To me, such favors are more negative than positive. They entrap both the student and me in a relationship that I find unrealistic and counterproductive. I want to be free. And I want students to be free. I don't want to be pampered like a pet. And I believe that the more fuss students make over a Zen teacher, the more betrayed they are going to feel when the Zen teacher turns out not to be providing them with what they probably unconsciously imagined would be forthcoming: perfect affection, intimacy, or approval. So I think everyone is saved a lot of trouble by a more normal and egalitarian custom of interaction with teachers. In the end, it isn't so much what is done for the teacher as the spirit and attitude with which it's done. I can imagine students waiting hand and foot on a teacher who remains humble, gracious and kind, understanding full well that what is being done isn't actually being done for him or her, that she is just a stand-in for the student's own Buddha nature. And I can imagine a teacher who is treated in an egalitarian way, having a lot of pride in her or his enlightened superiority, expressed in a Zen humility, while the teacher is actually lording it over the students in other probably subtler and more pernicious ways. How does the student know the teacher is a good, solid Zen teacher? I guess the student just feels like that's true until it's proven otherwise. Susan, I have heard you say you don't like to call yourself a teacher. Why is this? There are many people who are glad to call themselves your students. As I've been saying, I don't think of myself as a teacher, and I don't see what I'm doing as teaching Zen. I'm practicing Zen, and I'm willing and happy to share my practice with others. Also, I like to write, give talks, and interact with people, so I'm happy to do all this. But I'm not a master of Zen or a Zen teacher. I always think of the master Matsu, one of the great Zen teachers of the classical period in China, who yelled at the monastics for fawning over him, saying, "Don't you know there are no teachers of Zen?" One of them said, "Well, what about you and all the others who set up Zen centers?" He replied, "I don't say there is no Zen, only that there are no teachers of Zen." This pretty much describes how I feel. Of course, as I have also been saying, so-called teachers in Zen are very important to the process of the practice, at least if you want to practice Zen in the full traditional sense. They play a role, and I'm willing to play my role. I have practiced for a long time by now and have received all the ritual empowerments that allow me to even obligate me, play this role. So I'm happy to do it. But I know that doesn't make me, personally, a teacher, an inherently wise and special person. It only means I'm willing and able to take my place in the mandala of practice. And it is the mandala itself, the matrix of teachers, students, teachings, ritual, and so on, that transforms the practitioners. It's not me who transforms anyone. So we have 2.5 pages. I hope you are able to stay. Possibly some Zen or other spiritual teachers, in brackets, and this may go for other kinds of people, like artists, professors, and so on, enjoy the idea of themselves as teachers. They like the focus and the respect. I do too, to some extent. As I said, I would much rather be thought of as wise and kind than vilified as a scoundrel or ignored as a non-entity. But also I don't like being the center of many projections. Nor do I think my being the center of projections and the important person serves the practice well. Teacher-centered practice is less good, I believe, than practice that is student-centered. So for myself and for the practice, I think it is better for me to de-emphasize myself a teacher. Anyway, for better or worse, I can't help myself. I simply don't feel like a Zen teacher, an expert or master of Zen. And I honestly don't believe these labels fit me or describe me. And it is unpleasant and troublesome for me if other people make a big deal out of me as a Zen teacher. I would prefer to be free of all that. Having said all this, I don't want to deny that others may actually be Zen teachers or spiritual masters of various sorts. I notice that there are spiritual teachers who seem to be enlightened masters, who seem to acknowledge that they are enlightened masters and whom intelligent people attend with that in mind. Given that, I can only conclude that they really are enlightened masters, and I have no reason to doubt that. It's just that I am not an enlightened Zen teacher, and frankly, I have never been interested in that as a goal. What has interested me spiritually from the beginning has been simply to live a fully human life, including all the good and bad that a human life entails, and I've always imagined that this is what Zen teaches, at least this is what I have always seen in it. Excuse me, I have made a little mistake. Let me repeat the last sentence. And I have always imagined that this is what Zen teaches. At least this is what I have always seen in it. I'm sure others see other things. Besides, I'm basically a poet and a writer. You say there are people glad to call themselves my students. I appreciate that. And I see it as a two-way street. I feel they are giving me more than I'm giving them. So I'm grateful and dedicated to doing whatever I can in my necessarily limited way to support them. The last question put by Susan Monau for this chapter. Do Zen teachers need to have teachers? Do you still have a teacher, someone to whom you go for guidance in your practice? In Soto Zen, says Norman, every Zen teacher has a Zen teacher. In Soto Zen, there couldn't be a self-proclaimed, self-enlightened teacher, since in our tradition, what makes you a Zen teacher is a relationship, ritually sanctioned, with a Zen teacher who has him or herself been ritually sanctioned by his or her teacher through such a relationship. According to Zen mythology, even Buddha had a teacher, Kashyapa Buddha, who also had a teacher, and so on. So all Soto Zen teachers have had their teacher. Once you graduate, in brackets, by receiving either full priest ordination or lay teacher entrustment from your teacher, you are officially a teacher. That is, you are ritually empowered to take your place in the lineage and your seat as a teacher in a Zen Sangha, as we discussed earlier. But usually, you don't abandon your teacher or cut off relations with him or her. As long as your teacher is alive, you maintain the relationship, though it will probably be quite different now that you are on your own. It's a little like being the grown child of a parent. The parent is still the parent, but the relationship to him or her is quite different. At least one hopes so. The metaphor of a parent is inaccurate because relationships between Zen teachers and students are between adults. No one is a child, but the metaphor does illustrate what I meant to some extent. The older a teacher gets, the harder it is to have a relationship to a teacher. Quite probably his or her own teacher will have died. And when a teacher is very experienced, with many years of practice, it may be difficult to find another teacher who is mature enough. But as teachers go on with practice, they will know other teachers in their own generation, as I do, other teachers in the same lineage with whom they will have practiced, and also teachers in other lineages. Relationships with such teachers are very important, and they perhaps take the place of having your own teacher as time goes on. At least this has been the case for me. My good relationships with other Zen teachers, whom I've been lucky to know over the years, to learn from and respect, have become as important to me as my relationship with my teachers. They are different, of course, but at this point in my life, increasingly important. But I am fortunate. My teacher, Sojun Weitzman, is still very much alive and active at 86. This has changed in the meantime. He has died in January. As abbot of the Berkeley Zen Center, where I first met him 45 years ago. We are still close, and I see him from time to time, mostly in informal situations. I do ask him for advice on intimate Zen matters, but mostly when we get together, it is as good old friends. So, I'm happy you were with me. And I hope there are some treasures, or were some treasures for you in this interview. I find a quite skillful interview between Susan Moon and Norman Fischer to take home. As I said several times, I would like to share about this, but in this format it is not possible, and perhaps another time or at the end of the book we will create something like that. Wishing you a wonderful Easter if you are Christian, and if you are not Christian, a wonderful spring weekend. And next Sunday I cannot read from the book because we have our first session from Tiny Temple in Bonn that weekend, an experiment. But I think the Saturday then I will go on with the chapter Stages of Practice. So bye again and thank you.